When Samuel Ellington appeared at a medical station in Southside Chicago, after 6 months missing, he was barely recognizable. Skin and bones, wrinkled clothes stuck with dried blood, hands trembling as if he'd just escaped a place not meant for humans. The man who was once a businessman, vanished in the heart of the city, now returned in a state that made the entire system stop and look at him like living proof. But what truly chilled the doctors and police wasn't his appearance or physical condition. The most terrifying part lay in what he began to recount about how he was approached, taken right in the middle of normal life, and the months held in silence, in a place where, on record, no crime had ever existed. Some names and details have been changed to protect identity and privacy. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the morning of November 14, 2014, the wide concrete parking lot next to a cluster of warehouses on the west side of Chicago lay in the familiar calm of a regular midweek workday, where the usual sounds of truck engines and clanging metal hadn't yet started. Samuel Ellington, a businessman running a mid-sized building materials distribution company, pulled into the spot he'd used for years and shut his car door one last time like an unthinking habit. Samuel wasn't someone who liked risks or acted impulsively. He grew up in a stable environment, built his career on tight business relationships and a near unchangeable schedule. Every morning he left home on time, drove the same route through industrial areas, stopped at the main warehouse to check delivery paperwork, then continued to partner meeting points before heading back at the end of the day. According to people who'd worked with him, Samuel always showed up neat and tidy, carrying little personal stuff beyond his familiar briefcase, and rarely changed habits unless there was a clear work reason. That morning, some workers and delivery drivers saw Samuel step out of his car in completely normal condition, no signs of stress, no arguing with anyone, and carrying nothing beyond the everyday work items. The surrounding area kept its usual rhythm, warehouse doors opening and closing on schedule, with no unusual situation enough to draw attention. According to later records, Samuel planned to stay at the warehouse only briefly before moving to another location in the same business network, a schedule repeated hundreds of times before without incident. However, after that moment, Samuel didn't show up at any of his next planned stops that day. Calls from employees and partners went unanswered, and the phone that was always in his familiar coverage area suddenly went silent. The loss of contact happened quietly, without signs of force, no cries for help, no chaotic scene left behind, or any clear trace showing a crime had just occurred. By late afternoon, when Samuel didn't come home as usual, and hadn't notified anyone of a schedule change, his family began to notice something was wrong, because being late wasn't in his character or habits. Continued attempts to reach him brought no results as night fell, and the worry quickly turned into a clear sense of unease that Samuel had vanished from his tightly controlled rhythm of life. No message, no sign of preparing for a long trip, and no one could explain why someone as schedule-bound as Samuel would suddenly be completely absent. As time passed with no signal he'd return, the family decided to report to the police, officially declaring Samuel Ellington missing, closing what seemed like an ordinary day in Chicago, with the heavy silence of an inexplicable void. The missing person report from Samuel Ellington's family was received that same evening at a police station in the west side of Chicago, under circumstances where there were no clear signs of emergency, beyond the fact that a grown man had not returned home according to a schedule he'd maintained steadily for many years. Following standard procedure, the case was recorded as a missing adult, and the on-duty officers began by verifying the identity of the reporting person, the last time Samuel was seen, and the basic information needed to establish an initial timeline. The family was asked to provide recent photos, identification documents, a physical description, the usual mode of transportation, and Samuel's daily habits, in which they emphasized that he was a disciplined man who rarely changed plans without a specific work-related reason, and almost always gave advance notice before any schedule adjustment. The officers noted that Samuel had no history of mental disorders, did not use stimulants, had no serious health issues, and showed no signs of personal or family stress that relatives had noticed in recent times. Work-related information was gathered at a general level, showing that Samuel ran a business that was operating normally, not in the process of dissolution or restructuring, not involved in any public legal disputes, and showed no signs of significant financial pressure. The schedule for the day he went missing was reconstructed through accounts from his wife and key employees, confirming that Samuel left home on time, traveled his familiar route, planned to stop at several locations that had been repeated many times before, and was expected to return home in the late afternoon. Consistent with his usual habits, when assessing the risk level according to the classification framework for missing adults, the officers considered factors such as age, ability to self-care, circumstances of disappearance, and surrounding environment, ultimately determining that Samuel did not belong to a vulnerable group and did not fall into a high-risk situation requiring activation of an emergency response. The lack of a specific identified scene further reinforced this initial assessment, as there were no reports of a struggle, no personal belongings left in an unusual state, and no recorded signs of force or chaos at any location where Samuel was last seen. The family was questioned in detail about the possibility that Samuel had left voluntarily, for personal or work reasons, including the chance of a sudden business trip, an unplanned meeting with partners, or temporarily avoiding contact, but they affirmed there were no signs of preparation for a long trip, no behavior of arranging assets, no large cash withdrawals, and no explanatory message left behind. Samuel's contact list was recorded, including business partners, close friends, and places he frequently visited, to serve for follow-up checks in the coming days. However, at the time the report was taken, this data was mostly supportive, and not yet sufficient to form a hypothesis of criminal activity. Traffic and security camera systems in public areas, near the routes Samuel commonly traveled, were listed for later review, but there was no basis to cordon off areas, or initiate in-depth criminal investigation measures. The decision not to deploy large-scale search forces, or open a criminal case file, reflected how the law enforcement system handles most cases of missing adults without signs of coercion, where the initial assumption still leaned toward the possibility of voluntary absence for private reasons. Samuel's family was instructed to continue monitoring and immediately report any new information related to his financial activity, communications, or movements, while being explained that handling it at a monitoring level did not mean the case was being ignored, but rather a necessary evaluation step based on objective criteria. Nevertheless, the gap between the family's growing anxiety and the cautious procedural approach of the authorities became evident right in those first hours, when all the collected information described Samuel Ellington as a capable adult man who had disappeared from his everyday routine without leaving any clear indication that a crime had occurred at that time. 1 week after the missing person report for Samuel Ellington was received, initial search steps were implemented according to the standard procedure for an adult who disappeared without signs of coercion in Chicago, first focusing on reviewing traffic cameras and private security cameras along the routes he commonly traveled. Hours of data were extracted from major intersections, public parking lots, and the warehouse area where Samuel was last seen, with the goal of determining his direction of travel after he left the view of those around him. The review results showed Samuel's vehicle appearing for the last time within a time frame consistent with his familiar schedule, after which no further images were recorded, and there were also no signs indicating the car was followed, involved in a collision, or stopped under unusual circumstances. In parallel with the camera review, mobile phone location data was requested, but the device's signal had completely cut off after the time of disappearance, leaving no positioning chain long enough to reconstruct his subsequent journey. Financial transactions were checked at a basic level, including credit cards, bank accounts, and routine payments, but no activity was detected after the time Samuel was last seen, no cash withdrawals, no unusual payments, and no signs of financial preparation for a long-term departure. This data, rather than opening new investigative directions, reinforced the initial assessment that Samuel had disappeared in complete silence, leaving behind no digital or financial traces that could be followed. In the early stage, local media briefly reported on the disappearance of a businessman in the area, but when no new developments emerged, public interest quickly faded, news coverage became sparser, and eventually it only appeared sporadically in local news roundups. The lack of images, lack of witnesses, and lack of dramatic developments prevented the case from maintaining public attention, and media pressure on the authorities decreased accordingly. As time passed without new leads, with no information from Samuel's business partners, friends, or acquaintances sufficient to shift the evaluation, every checked avenue led back to the same conclusion: there was no evidence indicating a crime had occurred at the time of his disappearance. Internal reports noted that all reasonable search measures within the framework of a low-risk missing adult case had been carried out, and continuing to allocate significant resources to a file generating no new data was not feasible amid many other urgent cases requiring attention. After a certain period with no progress, Samuel Ellington's file was officially reclassified, moving from active monitoring status to archived status, with a note that this was a disappearance without signs of criminal activity and no leads to pursue further investigation at that time. This classification did not mean the case was fully closed, but in practice it marked the end of active search efforts, leaving the file in what is known as cold case status, where all related information remains in the system and is only reviewed if new data emerges. For Samuel's family, this shift carried a heavier meaning than any administrative term, as it meant no more timelines, no more specific search plans, and no clear answers to the question of where he was. The initial days of hope were gradually replaced by a prolonged state of waiting, where every incoming call was listened to in silence, and every small piece of news was treated as a fragile possibility to break the impasse. As weeks turned into months with no conclusion reached, Samuel's absence became a fixed void in the family's life, a reality unexplained but forced to be accepted, marking the phase when his disappearance officially entered a cold, unsolved, and directionless state within the investigative system. 6 months after Samuel Ellington's missing person file was classified as a cold case, an unexpected development occurred when he appeared on his own in the evening at a community health station located in the South Side area of Chicago, in a condition that immediately led the intake staff to determine this was not a routine medical visit. Samuel was brought into the intake area with a slow, shuffling gait, his body noticeably emaciated, clothes wrinkled, dirty, and soaked with blood in multiple places, while he carried no identification documents, phone, or any personal belongings. When asked for basic information, Samuel could only provide his name and answer simple questions in halting, fragmented responses, indicating a level of exhaustion and depletion far beyond what would result from a short-term incident. Medical staff recorded vital signs showing severe dehydration, low blood pressure, irregular heart rate, and signs of prolonged malnutrition, while also observing that his reflexes were slow and unfocused, as if his body and nervous system had endured a long period of stress. During the initial examination, doctors found no open wounds, fresh cuts, or acute injuries that could immediately explain the amount of blood soaked into Samuel's clothing, creating a clear discrepancy between his external appearance and the clinical findings. Thoroughly checked areas of skin revealed only old scrapes, faded bruises, and unevenly healed marks, indicating they did not occur at the same time and did not correspond to acute blood loss just before he arrived at the health station. Samuel's clothing, which was inappropriate for the current weather conditions and showed signs of having been worn for a long time without being changed, was handled by medical staff according to protocol for cases involving unusual factors, with priority given to preserving the original condition for later reporting. When Samuel could not produce identification and could not clearly provide information about his residence or means of transportation, intake staff began reviewing internal databases and quickly found that his name matched a previously archived missing person file, which elevated the case's alert level within the health station. As required by protocol, medical staff immediately notified law enforcement about the appearance of an individual potentially linked to a prior missing person case, while continuing to monitor Samuel's health to ensure he was not in immediate medical danger. When police arrived at the health station, they approached Samuel while he was still under medical observation and not yet in condition for any extended exchange. Initial identity confirmation was carried out by cross-referencing the personal information provided by the health station with archived data, allowing police to confirm that the man receiving treatment was indeed Samuel Ellington, who had been missing from his everyday life for 6 months without leaving any trace. Officers prepared an on-site report at the health station, documenting the time of Samuel's appearance, his overall physical condition, the fact that he carried no documents or personal property, and especially the blood-stained clothing that did not correspond to any newly discovered injuries. This information was recorded in detail because it did not align with the initial assumption of voluntary departure for personal reasons, which had been the basis for handling the file in the earlier phase. Medical staff provided police with a preliminary health report on Samuel's condition, emphasizing that his vital signs and clinical signs indicated he had undergone a prolonged period of depletion, rather than the aftermath of a single event that had occurred in the past few hours or days. Meanwhile, Samuel displayed clear confusion and significant distress when asked where he had been before arriving at the health station, with incoherent responses and evasive behavior suggesting he was not yet ready or able to recount what had happened. His choice to appear at a community health facility, rather than returning home or going to a familiar location, was noted as an important detail reflecting his disoriented state and lack of personal resources at that moment. Coordination between medical staff and police followed proper protocol, with the immediate priority being to ensure Samuel received full medical care, while collecting and preserving relevant information and items for later legal evaluation. Samuel's missing person file was pulled from archived status that very night, and previous notes about no signs of criminal activity were placed alongside the new data emerging from his current condition. The stark contrast between the image of a man with a stable life before disappearing and his current state of emaciation, lack of documents, and blood stains upon reappearance created a set of factors that authorities could not overlook, forcing them to re-examine the entire context of the case. Within the health station, administrative and medical procedures continued cautiously, with every small detail related to Samuel's condition being documented, as these elements could play a crucial role in assessing the cause and circumstances of his prolonged disappearance, while confirming that Samuel's appearance in Southside Chicago could not be viewed as a random occurrence or a normal case of voluntary return after a period of absence. In the period immediately after Samuel Ellington was medically stabilized at the health station in Southside Chicago, authorities conducted a series of initial checks to confirm his identity and objectively assess his condition, with the goal of eliminating any possibility of mistaken identity and building an accurate data foundation before making any investigative assumptions. Identity confirmation was first carried out by comparing Samuel's fingerprints with archived database records, resulting in a complete match that verified the man under care was indeed the individual reported missing 6 months earlier. In parallel, Samuel's prior medical records were retrieved to compare biological characteristics, including blood type, medical history, previous medical interventions, and health metrics recorded during routine checkups, further reinforcing the confirmation that there was no discrepancy in identity or possibility of confusion with another person. Once identity was firmly confirmed, attention shifted to the condition of the clothing Samuel was wearing upon arrival, particularly the bloodstains on the fabric. Preliminary tests were conducted to determine the biological origin of this blood, with priority given to analyzing whether the blood belonged to Samuel himself. Initial test results showed that the majority of the blood did not match Samuel's biological markers, while no fresh wounds, open injuries, or signs of acute blood loss, sufficient to explain the presence of blood at that density, were found on his body. The lack of a direct connection between his current physical state and the blood on his clothing was recorded as a significant unusual factor, as it ruled out the possibility that this was the result of an accident or incident occurring right before he arrived at the health station. Doctors continued to compare Samuel's current physical condition with his pre-disappearance medical data, noting a marked decline in weight, muscle mass, skin elasticity, and biochemical indicators, reflecting prolonged malnutrition and dehydration. These changes could not have developed over a short period, but required weeks or months of the body being placed in conditions of deprivation and inadequate care, which aligned with the 6-month period Samuel had been missing from his everyday life. Beyond general indicators, more detailed examination revealed the presence of calluses and old injuries in locations inconsistent with Samuel's prior familiar daily activities or work, including areas of skin that had prolonged contact with hard or rough surfaces. His fingernails and nail beds contained particles of dust, material fibers, and environmental traces incompatible with the office or warehouse spaces he used to frequent, indicating Samuel had been exposed to a distinctly different environment from his normal life. Medical experts also noted that Samuel's dental condition, skin and digestive system, reflected a lack of access to basic care conditions, including inadequate diet, poor hygiene, and no regular medical monitoring over an extended period. When this data was placed alongside Samuel's prior lifestyle records, which showed he had stable economic conditions and full access to healthcare services, the contrast became clear and difficult to explain by the hypothesis of voluntary departure under free conditions. Initial reports synthesized these findings into a consistent chain of indicators, including prolonged physical depletion, environmental traces not belonging to normal life, and the presence of blood of unknown origin on his clothing, all of which were incompatible with the scenario of an adult voluntarily disappearing and then returning. On that basis, investigators and forensic medical experts began forming a new working hypothesis in which the possibility that Samuel had been deprived of liberty for an extended period was considered the most reasonable explanation for the collected set of data. Confirmation of identity through biometrics, preliminary results on the origin of the blood on his clothing, and the systematic comparison between his current physical state and the time frame of Samuel Ellington's disappearance formed a consistent picture, showing that this prolonged absence did not fit any typical pattern of voluntary departure seen in adults with stable lives. The objective data gathered not only ruled out the earlier administrative hypothesis, but also compelled authorities to recognize this as a phase in which Samuel had been separated from his familiar living environment, under conditions of continuous control, with clear and lasting physical impacts. On the basis of that assessment, the focus of handling shifted from identity verification to clarifying what had happened inside Samuel's body throughout the period of his disappearance, leading to the establishment and expansion of an in-depth medical file at the treatment facility, where doctors concentrated on a comprehensive analysis of physiological, histological, and metabolic changes to determine the extent of damage and the physical circumstances Samuel Ellington had endured. The initial evaluation focused on chronic malnutrition, identified not only through clinical observation, but also through lab indicators, showing prolonged deficiencies in energy and micronutrients. Samuel's body mass index had dropped sharply compared to his prior medical data, with a noticeably thin subcutaneous fat layer, reduced skeletal muscle mass in most major muscle groups, particularly the thighs, shoulders and back, reflecting a gradual process of muscle wasting rather than the aftermath of an acute illness episode. Blood biochemistry tests showed persistently low albumin levels, stable but abnormal electrolyte imbalances, iron deficiency, vitamin B group deficiency, and signs of depleted energy reserves, factors commonly seen in cases where adequate food portions were not provided over an extended period. Clinical nutrition specialists noted that these manifestations were inconsistent with short-term fasting, voluntary irregular eating, or a controlled diet, but instead reflected a systemic state of malnutrition. Subsequent analysis focused on the old wounds on Samuel's body, revealing multiple injuries at varying stages of recovery, from faded bruises turning greenish-yellow, scrapes that had formed new skin, to irregular small scars, indicating asynchronous healing processes. The scattered and non-simultaneous appearance of these injuries suggested Samuel had endured repeated mechanical impacts over a prolonged period, rather than a single incident. Forensic medical doctors observed that many bruises and scars were in locations uncommon in routine household accidents, including the hips, inner arms, wrists, and lower back, suggesting frequent contact with hard surfaces or compression in unnatural postures. Joint and bone analysis showed signs of chronic microtrauma in the shoulder, elbow, wrist, and lumbar spine joints, accompanied by mild persistent inflammation, reflecting the need to maintain repeated physical activities or confined postures over a long time without adequate rest conditions. The presence of thick calluses on the palms and fingers, combined with soft tissue damage on the forearms, was assessed as evidence of frequent contact with tools or rough materials, incompatible with Samuel's prior professional life, which mainly took place in managerial and office environments. Skin analysis revealed localized areas of hyperkeratosis, prolonged dry skin, and chronic irritation patches, suggesting long-term exposure to an environment with poor hygiene conditions, limited ventilation, or unstable temperatures. Samuel's fingernails and nail beds were brittle, darkened, and accumulated with debris, reflecting a prolonged lack of personal care, a characteristic inconsistent with his previous habits. His dental condition showed chronic gingivitis, enamel wear, and signs of calcium deficiency, reflecting a lack of access to basic hygiene and dental care. Medical specialists also noted changes in the digestive system, including mild malabsorption, and the body's adaptive response to prolonged dietary deficiency, signs that only appear when malnutrition has persisted for many months. Based on the synthesis of clinical, paraclinical data and comparison with medical records prior to disappearance, the medical team estimated the time frame during which Samuel was under physical control, based on the rate of muscle wasting, the degree of micronutrient depletion, and the recovery stages of soft tissue injuries. This estimate indicated that his body had adapted to a state of prolonged deprivation, a process that only occurs when an individual has no autonomy over diet, movement, and rest. The evaluation also considered the possibility that Samuel voluntarily disappeared and lived under difficult conditions of his own accord, but this scenario was analyzed and ruled out on medical grounds, as no signs of mental disorder were detected, no evidence of substance use was found, and none of the biological characteristics typically seen in intentional self-harm cases were present. Given Samuel's prior economic status, level of education, and access to healthcare services, maintaining such a state of depletion in a free environment was deemed inconsistent with medical logic. The medical file was therefore completed as a detailed record of the progressive health decline over time, reflecting a combination of chronic malnutrition, repeated physical trauma, signs of abnormal environmental exposure, and biological features incompatible with normal free life. Samuel Ellington's psychological profile was conducted in parallel with the medical monitoring process at the treatment facility in Chicago, with the goal of assessing the level of psychological trauma he was experiencing and determining his capacity to participate in investigative cooperation activities during the initial phase. Clinical psychologists noted that Samuel clearly exhibited signs of prolonged psychological trauma, including a state of heightened vigilance, startle responses to unexpected sounds, difficulty maintaining prolonged eye contact, and a tendency to avoid topics when conversations touched on periods he could not control in his memory. His breathing rate often increased rapidly when questioned about the time he was missing, accompanied by facial and hand muscle tension, indicating that his body was still reacting as if under threat even though the surrounding environment was safe. Standard assessment tools showed Samuel exhibited significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but without signs of detachment from reality or severe thought disorders, allowing experts to determine that he retained basic cognitive capacity and orientation to space, time, and self. Analysis of memory and event recall showed that Samuel's memory was not globally impaired, but there was clear fragmentation specifically related to high-stress periods. He could accurately recall details from before his disappearance, including work schedules, familiar locations, and specific timelines, but when asked to speak about the subsequent period, memories became disjointed, out of sequence, and frequently interrupted by strong emotions. Experts assessed this as a common defense mechanism in individuals who have experienced prolonged trauma, where the brain prioritizes survival by limiting access to painful memories. Samuel tended to recall fragmented images, bodily sensations, and sounds more than logical sequences of events, which directly affected his ability to coherently recount what had happened during the time he was under control. In the initial evaluation sessions, Samuel showed limited cooperation, willing to answer questions related to his current health and feelings, but displaying clear reluctance when the content touched on specific details about people, locations, or behaviors related to the disappearance period. Psychologists noted that pressuring Samuel to provide detailed information too early risked exacerbating trauma responses, potentially leading to emotional shutdown or complete withdrawal from the cooperation process. On that basis, the initial limits of investigative cooperation were clearly defined, with consensus that Samuel should only participate in short, controlled exchanges focused on the least emotionally triggering information during this phase. Preparing conditions for detailed statement-taking sessions was considered a process that needed careful planning, including ensuring Samuel was in stable physical condition, receiving continuous psychological support, and being provided with a safe, familiar space to minimize feelings of threat. Experts recommended that future sessions should be short in duration, include breaks, and allow Samuel to stop on his own when feeling overwhelmed, rather than using prolonged or high-pressure interrogation formats. Based on the comprehensive assessment, an appropriate interview strategy was outlined, focusing on a trauma-informed approach in which the interviewer maintained a supportive rather than confrontational role, using open, neutral questions, and avoiding suggestive details that could lead to false memories or defensive reactions. This strategy also emphasized restoring Samuel's sense of control, allowing him to decide the pace and scope of information shared, thereby increasing the likelihood of gathering accurate data without further harming his psychological state. Psychologists assessed that although Samuel Ellington was not yet ready to provide a complete narrative, his cognitive capacity remained intact, and his conditional cooperation allowed for information collection along a tightly controlled timeline. The step-by-step approach, respecting psychological boundaries, was agreed upon as the optimal method to avoid re-traumatization, while still meeting necessary investigative requirements during this sensitive phase. When the minimum criteria for physical and psychological stability were confirmed, the first statement-taking session was conducted within that framework, and in a controlled space, Samuel began to reconstruct the process of approach, abduction, and escape through fragmented but logically connected pieces of memory, consistent with the recall pattern that experts had anticipated beforehand. Samuel identified Robert Miller as the first person to approach him, not through violence or threats, but through a carefully constructed and prolonged business cooperation cover that lasted long enough to create a sense of familiarity. Robert presented himself as a knowledgeable broker, speaking the exact language of the industry, understanding the supply chain challenges Samuel's business was facing, and always positioning himself as a potential partner, rather than a pitchman. Initial exchanges took place via email and short meetings at public locations in the industrial area, where Samuel was already accustomed to interacting with various partners, so Robert did not stand out negatively, and raised no warning signals. According to Samuel, Robert did not pressure for contracts, made no unusual demands, but patiently built trust with seemingly reasonable information, enough to make in-person meetings a normal part of the work schedule. The control moment occurred on what seemed like an ordinary workday, while Samuel was in the familiar parking lot preparing to leave for his next appointment, and Robert had timed it so there were enough people around that no one would notice a quick and clean situation. The method of control was described by Samuel as brief, sudden, and focused on rendering him unable to resist in the first few dozen seconds, long enough to take control without creating noise or a chaotic scene in public, so those nearby did not realize a deprivation of liberty had just occurred. Immediately afterward, Samuel was removed from his familiar activity area through a continuous and calculated process, including changing vehicles, redirecting travel multiple times, and completely restricting his ability to observe, causing him to quickly lose orientation and be unable to determine where he was. He described the feeling of being detached from everyday life, not through specific images, but through the gradual loss of time markers, when day and night were no longer clearly distinguished, and all activities followed a rhythm controlled by others. The conditions of confinement were reconstructed by Samuel through physical and psychological sensations, indicating a confined space with limited natural light, where human contact was controlled and inconsistent, as if monitoring was divided into shifts or assigned among multiple people. He was not told the specific location, had no access to any communication devices, and all basic needs depended entirely on his captors, creating a state of absolute dependence and prolonged stress. Samuel described that for most of the time he was held, he was not openly assaulted, but always remained under implicit threat, with control actions sufficient to make him understand that any resistance effort was futile in the context of his gradually deteriorating physical condition. Supervision was not always at the same level of focus, and over time, repeated habits in the guarding routine began to form, creating small but dangerous gaps if discovered. Samuel stated that it was precisely this repetition, along with occasional complacency from the guards during shift changes, or when fatigued, that allowed him to begin recognizing that there was still a possibility to act, however slim. The decisive mistake occurred in a moment when control was looser than usual, when the guard's attention was no longer fully focused on him, and environmental factors created a gap sufficient for him to leave the confinement position. The escape process was described by Samuel as a series of survival reflexes, rather than a deliberate plan, as he acted in a state of panic, limited physical strength, and not fully clear awareness, focusing solely on putting as much distance as possible between himself and the controlled area. During movement, he collided with many hard surfaces, slipped and fell, and sustained scrapes, causing old wounds to be aggravated, while also coming into contact with blood that was not his own during the process of getting out of the area, which explained the blood-stained clothing when he reappeared. Samuel could not precisely determine the time or distance traveled after escaping, only remembering that he moved in a near-instinctive state, avoiding any signs reminiscent of the confinement place, and seeking a location with other people present. Memories of this phase were fragmented, with overlapping images and sensations, accurately reflecting the psychological state of someone who had just escaped prolonged control. In the statement, Robert Miller was mentioned as the direct link leading to Samuel's control, but not the only person who appeared throughout the entire confinement process, indicating the existence of a structured role-divided control system in which Robert played the role of initial approach and activation. The entire statement took place with many pauses for Samuel to stabilize his emotions. The details were not in linear order, but when pieced together formed a logical sequence about the approach through a business cover, the discreet abduction method in public, the process of removing the victim from the familiar environment, prolonged controlled confinement conditions, a lapse in guarding, and a moment leading to escape, along with a consistent explanation for the origin of the blood on his clothing upon reappearing in Chicago, consistent with the prior medical and psychological assessments that had been established. Based on Samuel Ellington's statement, combined with what he could indirectly recall through bodily sensations and repeatedly recurring environmental details, the confinement process he endured was described as a closed, organized system designed to maintain long-term control in a space completely isolated from outside life in Chicago. Samuel could not precisely identify the geographic location of the confinement space, but he consistently described it as an enclosed area lacking natural light, where time was not marked by clocks or familiar day and night signals, causing his sense of time to gradually erode. The surrounding surfaces felt rough, cold, and fixed, with very few movable items, creating an environment that both restricted movement and minimized the possibility of using anything as a tool to aid escape. Samuel's living conditions were tightly controlled at the bare minimum necessary to sustain life, including limited repetitive food portions provided at irregular times, enough to prevent complete physical collapse, but insufficient to restore strength. Drinking water was supplied under control, sometimes delayed, making mild dehydration a constant state that contributed to diminished thinking and reaction abilities. Sleep and rest followed no fixed schedule, depending on environmental conditions and permission from his captors, causing Samuel to frequently fall into exhaustion from prolonged sleep deprivation. The mechanism for restricting information was implemented thoroughly, as Samuel had no access to any media, outside sounds, or information about time, location, or the state of the outside world, completely severing any concept of the flow of events. Human interaction was reduced to a minimum, consisting mainly of short, non-negotiable commands sufficient to maintain compliance without creating any personal connection, thereby preventing the victim from establishing any channel to extract information. Samuel's movement was strictly controlled, limited to a very narrow range, and always under direct or indirect supervision, making it impossible for him to build a mental map of the space or systematically identify an exit. Any rare changes in position, if they occurred, took place under conditions of restricted vision, rendering all orientation efforts meaningless. The goal of the confinement process, as Samuel perceived it, was not immediate harm, but to keep him alive in a state of long-term control, where existence depended entirely on others, creating an absolute power relationship. The absence of serious injuries from the outset, combined with maintaining the minimum provision of survival needs, indicated an intent to prolong the period of control, rather than end it quickly. Samuel observed that monitoring and provision behaviors were carried out in a calculated manner, as if his captors were carefully weighing the degree of his depletion, to avoid crossing a dangerous threshold, while keeping him in a continuous state of weakness. During confinement, Samuel noted signs that the surrounding environment was not entirely static, including repeated mechanical sounds, slight changes in air odor, and cyclical activities, suggesting that the confinement space might be part of a larger area being used for other purposes. These details, though not visually clear, created the sense that the confinement was not an impulsive act, but part of a premeditated plan with pre-prepared physical facilities. Samuel also described subtle changes over time in the methods of supervision and provision, such as adjustments to food portions, shifts in human contact timing, or procedures becoming more regular, giving him the feeling that a new phase was being prepared, though he did not know specifically what it was. These signs included a reduction in random interruptions and increased consistency in control activities, as if those carrying it out were shifting from a reactive state to a stable operational state. Although Samuel could not identify the ultimate purpose of the confinement, he clearly sensed that his existence was calculated within a long time frame, where sustaining life stemmed not from compassion, but from the need to keep the victim in a controllable and usable state when required. Samuel Ellington's experiences in the isolated confinement space, from strictly controlled living conditions, mechanisms restricting information and movement, to the clear perception that he was being held as part of a prolonged plan, formed a unified pattern, showing that this was not impulsive detention behavior. That structure reflected a deliberately designed process aimed at maintaining the victim's life, while gradually weakening resistance capability, while also revealing signs that the deprivation of liberty was only one phase in a larger calculation. From this basis, when investigators compiled the statement and cross-referenced every detail Samuel could recall during the time he was under control, the focus of analysis began shifting toward identifying the person behind the entire plan, a process not based on direct confession, but gradually formed from the fragmented information he accumulated throughout his confinement. Samuel stated that for most of the time he was held, he was rarely given clear information, but through indirect exchanges, brief commands, and changes in the manner of supervision, he gradually realized that Robert Miller was not acting independently. Robert appeared as the direct person who approached, controlled, and participated in supervision, but major decisions regarding timing, living conditions, and level of control seemed not entirely made by Robert. Samuel recalled many moments in which Robert had to wait for instructions, changed his behavior after private communications, or showed clear tension as if under pressure from an unseen superior. These signs led Samuel to believe that Robert was merely hired to carry out the direct tasks, while decision-making authority lay with someone else who rarely appeared at the confinement location. Over time, the name Michael Johnson began to emerge indirectly, not through formal introduction, but through snippets of interrupted conversations, authoritative reminders, and sudden changes in control procedures. Following communications, Samuel was not allowed to witness directly. Samuel never saw Michael, but he recognized that every time this name was mentioned, Robert's attitude changed, becoming more cautious and strictly adhering to new directives. Piecing these details together with memories of business relationships prior to his disappearance helped Samuel gradually identify Michael Johnson not as a stranger, but as the head of a company operating in the same field as his own. Before disappearing, Samuel had known Michael as a market competitor, where both companies targeted the same large contracts and strategic clients, creating a fiercely competitive, but still legally bounded environment. Samuel recalled that in the period leading up to the approach, this competition had grown increasingly intense, with contracts being snatched away closely, supply chains coming under pressure, and partnership relationships becoming more fragile. This information, when placed alongside Robert Miller's role as the intermediary, who approached through a business cooperation cover, formed a logical connection in terms of motive and method. Robert was not only hired to carry out the abduction, but also served as the bridge between Michael Johnson and Samuel, allowing Michael to maintain a safe distance from the criminal act, while still achieving the goal of removing a competitor from the market for a sufficiently long period. Samuel perceived that the motive was not simply personal harm, but rather to strip away his ability to run the business, disrupt company operations, cause loss of credibility, and create conditions for the competitor to seize market share without open confrontation. In his statement, Samuel emphasized that throughout the confinement period, there was no indication of any intent to release him early. On the contrary, all living conditions were maintained at the bare minimum necessary for survival, as if the controlled time was part of a long-term plan. Changes in supervision procedures, adjustments to food portions, and cyclical control methods led Samuel to believe that the detention was tied to specific timelines or external developments he was not aware of, most likely related to business circumstances and his company's position in the market. Michael Johnson's directing role thus did not manifest through direct action, but through designing the entire context, selecting the executor, defining the objective, and maintaining remote control. Samuel described Michael as someone who did not need to appear to exert power, because his very absence from the confinement space was the clearest sign that this was a plan run at a higher level, with clear role division between the mastermind and the executor. Cross-referencing Samuel Ellington's statement with the competitive context between the two companies in the same industry, allowed investigators to clearly identify a tightly role-divided action structure, in which the employer-employee relationship between Robert Miller and Michael Johnson fully accounted for the elements of motive, method, and benefit. Michael held the position of overall planner and coordinator, while Robert directly carried out the approach, control, and maintenance of confinement, creating an intermediary layer to separate the director from the scene and minimize the risk of traceable responsibility. From that foundation, Samuel's statement shows that depriving him of his life was not a random possibility that arose during confinement, but a step already built into the plan, only temporarily postponed according to strategic calculations that he sensed through the systematic changes in how he was treated. Samuel stated that throughout most of the time he was under control, he was never given any indication of the possibility of being released, and every element of his living conditions carried a temporary maintenance quality, as if his life was only being extended until it was no longer needed. Through fragmented bits of information he overheard in conversations not meant for him, especially the short remarks and tense attitude of Robert Miller, Samuel gradually realized that his death had been part of the plan from the beginning, only not yet carried out because the timing was not right. He recalled Robert repeatedly mentioning things like "wait until everything calms down" or "can't do it too soon," phrases that came without explanation, but were enough for Samuel to understand that his disappearance was still being monitored from the outside, and any outcome that happened too early could draw unwanted attention. In Samuel's perception, the projected timeline was not defined by specific dates, but by signs in the operation of the confinement, when small changes began appearing systematically. He described that after a long, relatively stable period, the control procedures suddenly became stricter, unsupervised periods were narrowed, and the already very limited flexibility almost completely disappeared. Food portions were adjusted toward an even more minimal level, not to starve him immediately, but to keep his body in a weakened state, alive, but hard to recover, making him increasingly dependent and reducing his ability to react. These changes led Samuel to believe the plan had entered the final preparation phase, where maintaining his life was only temporary, waiting until external conditions allowed for an irreversible action. The reason for delaying the execution, as Samuel understood from what he heard and sensed, was closely tied to the external context where he had existed as a public figure in the business world. His sudden disappearance had attracted attention for a certain period, and killing him right then carried the risk of his death being directly linked to the disappearance, triggering prolonged investigation and scrutiny. In contrast, keeping him alive long enough for the case to gradually fade into obscurity would make any later outcome easier to view as an unexplained incident, or even leave insufficient data to connect it back to the time of his disappearance. During this phase, Robert Miller's role became different from before, shifting from routine control maintainer to someone focused on ensuring no mistakes occurred that could derail the plan. Samuel described Robert appearing more frequently, speaking less, and almost no longer engaging in habitual interactions. Instead, there was heightened attention to every small detail related to supervision and movement restriction. Robert's attitude became cold and mechanical, as if he were carrying out a preset task with clear instructions from outside, rather than acting on emotion or personal judgment. Samuel sensed that Robert was not the one deciding to kill him, but would certainly be the one to carry it out directly once the time was set, making the threat no longer abstract, but specific and imminent. In the final days before his escape, Samuel noticed many signs that led him to believe the risk had increased significantly, including reduced elements for maintaining morale, increased isolation, and tighter restrictions on access to the surrounding space. He described the feeling of being placed in a passive waiting state, where each passing day was not an extension of life, but a step closer to a predetermined outcome. The danger Samuel faced in this phase lay not only in the existing intent to kill him within the plan, but also in the reality that his depleted physical condition made self-defense, resistance, or escape increasingly difficult, turning any delay into what could be a final mistake. He stated that it was precisely this clear awareness of approaching a point of no return that made him willing to take an extreme risk when the rare escape opportunity appeared. Because staying put meant waiting for a coldly planned action, in which his life was merely a variable in the calculations of those behind it, rather than a value to be preserved. After Samuel Ellington's statement was recorded at a level detailed enough to support tracing efforts, investigators began cross-referencing each piece of information he provided with available field data in Chicago and surrounding areas, with the focus not on immediately pinpointing an exact address, but on reconstructing a set of conditions matching his description of the confinement space. Samuel could not provide specific coordinates or place names, but he supplied recurring sensory elements, including low air humidity, the smell of metal and old oil, cyclical mechanical sounds, and distinct temperature changes between day and night, despite the absence of natural light. These details were compared against maps of old industrial zones, abandoned warehouses, and decommissioned production facilities, within driving distance reachable in a short time after he was taken. Traffic data, security camera footage, and property rental records were reviewed to narrow down locations, fitting the description of allowing discrete movement, low foot traffic, and the ability to avoid attention over a long period. Investigators paid particular attention to sites with irregular usage histories, frequent changes in ownership, or rentals under intermediary names, as such places were often infrequently inspected and easier to conceal unusual activity. The narrowing process gradually focused on a few locations that simultaneously met multiple criteria, including enclosed structures, natural soundproofing, limited ventilation systems, and signs of prior use for storage or small-scale production. As investigation teams conducted on-site checks in phases, they concentrated on finding evidence of long-term habitation rather than signs of a short-term event, since Samuel's statement and medical records indicated prolonged controlled confinement. At one of the suspect locations, investigators discovered signs of habitation inconsistent with normal warehouse use, including unusual wear patterns on the floor in a fixed area, traces of makeshift sleeping spots, small accumulations of daily waste, and minimal items used solely to sustain life without any comfort features. These traces did not appear all at once, but were distributed over time, indicating the prolonged presence of an individual with severely restricted movement in a narrow area. Samples collected at the scene were analyzed to determine the degree of match with Samuel's physical condition, where scratches on rough surfaces, repeated contact marks, and poor hygiene conditions were directly compared to the skin injuries, calluses, and contamination noted in his medical file. The comparison results showed a clear compatibility between the environment at this site and Samuel's physical signs, particularly those related to long-term contact with hard surfaces, poor ventilation, and lack of natural light. Investigators also noted the presence of materials and fine dust consistent with particles found on Samuel's clothing and under his fingernails upon reappearance, reinforcing the link between his statement and the physical site. The collection of habitation traces was not limited to the direct confinement space, but extended to ancillary areas where monitoring, supply delivery, or controlled movement may have occurred. Building a spatial picture consistent with Samuel's description of information and movement restriction mechanisms he experienced. Investigators cross-referenced the estimated duration of Samuel's confinement with the degree of environmental wear, observing that the signs were not the result of short-term activity, but reflected repeated use over many months, aligning with the period he was missing. These findings were placed alongside medical data on chronic malnutrition, microtrauma, and signs of forced labor, demonstrating a logical relationship between the confinement environment and the victim's bodily state. Throughout the tracing process, investigators maintained a cautious approach, avoiding hasty conclusions and focusing on building a chain of connections between the statement, physical traces, and medical records to assess the fit of each suspect location. The process of narrowing down and identifying the specific confinement site was carried out as a systematic series of comparisons, in which every small detail Samuel Ellington recalled, from air characteristics and contact surfaces to accumulated traces of habitation over time, was placed within the overall context of his prolonged controlled experience. Combining these elements with field data created a sufficiently solid objective foundation, allowing investigative authorities to move to deeper analysis steps without relying on subjective speculation or assumptions beyond the scope of evidence. On that basis, the analysis of the modus operandi and role division was carried out by synthesizing the statement, on-site examination results, and confirmed behavioral traces, clarifying that this was a plan constructed with a high degree of calculation, prioritizing discretion, and the ability to maintain long-term control rather than direct violence, especially in the initial approach phase in Chicago. The non-violent approach method was identified as the key factor enabling the plan to run smoothly from the start, when Robert Miller did not use threats or overt coercion, but instead exploited a legitimate business cooperation context, where trust was built through specialized language, reasonable appointments, and familiar public locations. This approach significantly reduced Samuel's alertness, while avoiding any unusual signals that could attract attention from those around him or security systems. The choice of the control moment in a public space but executed in a quick, clean, and non-disruptive manner reflected a deep understanding of crowd behavior and blind spots in surveillance, allowing the action to occur in a very short time without leaving a clear scene. Robert Miller's operational role was therefore identified as the direct operational link, responsible for the approach, control, initial movement organization, and routine maintenance of control over the victim, including supervision, provision of minimum survival needs, and adjustment of control levels according to directives. Robert did not play the role of overall strategic planner, but executed pre-designed steps, as evidenced by strict adherence to procedures, limiting unplanned situations, and maintaining necessary distance to avoid creating any personal connection with the victim. Meanwhile, Michael Johnson's organizational role was identified through a remote command structure, where strategic decisions such as timing of approach, long-term control objectives, level of life maintenance, and final disposition direction did not originate from Robert, but from a higher level. Michael did not appear at the confinement scene, did not participate in daily operations, but was the direct beneficiary of Samuel being removed from business life, showing a clear separation between the organizer and the executor to minimize legal risk. The calculated and systematic prolongation was evident in the plan, not aiming for immediate results, but targeting the maintenance of a controlled state for a sufficiently long time to completely undermine Samuel's market position, while allowing the disappearance to gradually fade from public awareness. Maintaining living conditions at a minimum but stable level showed the goal was not rapid injury, but prolonged dependence, erosion of will and resistance capability, thereby keeping the victim in a controllable state without creating acute signs easily detectable. The flexible adjustments in confinement procedures, from food portions and supervision timing to isolation levels, reflected continuous assessment of the victim's condition to avoid crossing dangerous thresholds while still achieving control objectives. Delaying decisive actions until external conditions were favorable demonstrated the plan was built with long-term vision, independent of the executor's emotions or immediate reactions. Evaluating the plan's level of danger showed this to be a criminal model capable of causing serious consequences, not only for the individual victim, but also for the business environment and societal security in general, as it exploited gaps in legitimate economic interactions to conceal deprivation of liberty. The clear role division between organizer and executor, combined with the nonviolent approach method, significantly increased the likelihood of success and prolonged concealment time, while making detection and tracing far more complex than with direct violent acts. The danger level also lay in the plan's ability to adapt to real developments without altering its core structure, keeping the victim perpetually passive and making it difficult to create opportunities to break the control cycle. Synthesizing these elements showed that the tactics used were not random or opportunistic, but the result of meticulous calculation, tight role assignment, and clear objectives, in which Robert Miller handled the direct operational role, while Michael Johnson held the organizational directive and beneficiary role, forming a criminal structure with a high level of danger and the potential for widespread harm, if not stopped in time. After the entire analysis of the modus operandi, role division and chain of criminal behavior reached a stable level for investigative purposes, authorities moved to the arrest phase, with the key requirement that all actions be based on verified evidence, leaving no legal gaps that could weaken the case. First, investigators systematized all of Samuel Ellington's statement evidence, clearly separating details he directly experienced, elements he inferred from his captor's behavior, and facts that could be independently cross-checked with field evidence. This process aimed to eliminate any possibility of subjective interpretation without material support, while highlighting details that matched between the statement and collected traces. Physical evidence at the confinement site, including traces of prolonged habitation, contact surfaces causing bodily injury, and environmental conditions consistent with the medical file, was classified and coded to form a linked chain of evidence, allowing direct tracing from the statement to the scene. In parallel, the clothing Samuel was wearing upon reappearance was analyzed in greater depth, not only to determine the origin of the bloodstains, but also to reconstruct the circumstances under which they formed, thereby reinforcing the connection between the escape behavior and the previously identified confinement space. When these groups of evidence converged consistently around Robert Miller's direct role, the investigative agency assessed that there was sufficient basis to proceed to arrest without waiting for additional confirmatory elements. The arrest decision was made based on a risk analysis, prioritizing the element of surprise to prevent Robert from destroying documents, contacting accomplices, or adjusting his statement. The arrest operation was carried out discreetly, with coordination between investigative units and support forces to ensure safety for both the executing personnel and the target. Immediately after Robert was deprived of liberty, the interrogation process began in a context where investigators already held most of the key data, allowing them to check the consistency of his statement in real time. Specific behavioral milestones were presented for comparison, forcing Robert to explain his role in each phase, from initial approach control, movement organization, to maintaining confinement. During this process, every instance of evasion, contradiction or statement adjustment was recorded and compared with existing objective data. At the same time, Robert's personal devices, including phone, computer, paper documents, and financial records, were seized, sealed, and transferred for analysis to support the expansion of the investigation. The focus of this expansion phase was to clarify the employer-employee relationship and command chain leading to the abduction, in which Michael Johnson was identified as the organizational link whose role needed to be proven through consistent but indirect evidence. Investigators reviewed financial transactions, showing irregularities, intermediary contracts, and business connections that could explain Robert receiving the task of approaching Samuel, thereby building a picture of motive and benefit. The strengthening of the prosecution file proceeded in parallel with the investigation, with early involvement of prosecutors to evaluate the legal value of each evidence group, ensuring that every accused act was linked to at least one independent source of proof. Prosecutors required standardization of all documents, from scene reports and evidence seizure records to statement summaries, to create a clear, coherent, and easily traceable file structure. The completion of the on-site investigation was also elevated to a higher level of detail, not only confirming the main confinement space, but also extending to related ancillary areas for monitoring, supply delivery, and movement, ensuring all relevant physical elements were recorded and analyzed. Traces were compared one final time with Samuel's medical file to confirm consistency in timing and injury severity. When all these steps were completed, the case file reached a complete investigative status, with Robert Miller legally arrested and Michael Johnson becoming the central target in the expanded file, in a context where all arrest and evidence collection measures were carried out in full compliance with criminal procedure, ensuring legality, continuity, and evidentiary value of the entire documentation before the judicial system in Chicago. On the basis of the standardized and systematized case file, the prosecution process was initiated by constructing separate but closely interconnected indictments against Robert Miller and Michael Johnson, clearly reflecting each individual's role, level of participation, and corresponding criminal responsibility throughout the entire chain of criminal acts. For Robert Miller, the indictment focused on the direct operational acts constituting the offenses, including the deliberate approach of the victim under the guise of legitimate business cooperation, carrying out unlawful control in a manner that avoided drawing attention in a public setting, organizing the victim's removal from his familiar living environment, and maintaining prolonged confinement through physical and spatial control measures. The indictment content detailed each phase of Robert's actions, closely cross-referenced with Samuel Ellington's statement, confinement site traces, field data, and medical records, to prove the continuity, intent, and degree of control exercised by the defendant throughout the period the victim was deprived of liberty. Prosecutors emphasized that although Robert was not the one proposing the overall plan, his day-to-day operational decisions, from supervision, adjustment of living conditions, to restriction of movement, were proactive at the execution level and sufficient to establish independent criminal responsibility at a high level of severity. The indictment also clarified the intentional maintenance of the victim's life at a minimum level to serve the goal of long-term control, thereby ruling out the possibility that the behavior was merely impulsive or lacking awareness of consequences. For Michael Johnson, the indictment was constructed to prove his role as the mastermind, organizer, and remote director, focusing on designing the plan, selecting Robert Miller as the executor, setting the objective of eliminating a business competitor, and maintaining the control structure, without needing to appear directly at the confinement location. Prosecutors presented a chain of consistent but indirect evidence, including the competitive context between the two companies in the same industry, clear benefit-driven motive, employer-employee relationship, financial transactions of a supportive nature, and role separation aimed at concealing criminal responsibility. The indictment against Michael did not rely on a single act, but focused on proving overall control of the plan, demonstrated through the ability to decide objectives, timing, and methods of maintaining confinement, as well as directly benefiting from the victim's removal from business management life. Clearly delineating the legal roles between Robert Miller and Michael Johnson formed the cornerstone of the prosecution strategy, enabling the trial panel to accurately identify each defendant's level of culpability and avoid conflating the executor with the organizer in a case featuring a tightly structured role division. The prosecution file was organized in chronological and behavioral logic sequence, with each charge linked to a specific set of evidence, including the victim's statement, physical evidence, field data, forensic analysis, and medical conclusions, ensuring every link in the chain of acts had independent grounds for proof. Preparation of the trial file included standardizing all interrogation records, scene reports, expert conclusions, and financial documents, while constructing comparison tables to clarify the connection between the accused acts and their direct consequences for the victim, thereby assisting the trial panel in evaluating the case as a whole, without speculation. The prosecution strategy was defined as evidence and structure-based, prioritizing objective proof over emotional exploitation to ensure the file could withstand common defense tactics in complex cases involving prolonged confinement and remote direction. Prosecutors planned to present the case in logical layers, starting with Robert Miller's specific and easily verifiable acts, then gradually expanding to Michael Johnson's organizational role and motive, thereby highlighting the linkage between the two defendants in a unified yet clearly role-divided plan. At the same time, this strategy minimized reliance on the victim's single statement by situating it within a network of independently verified evidence, enhancing the overall credibility of the file. The selection of expert witnesses, including forensic specialists, scene investigators, financial analysts, and medical evaluators, was carefully considered to explain technical details clearly, helping the trial panel understand the operational mechanism of the criminal plan and the causal relationship between acts and consequences. The prosecution was carried out with the objective of fully reflecting the nature of the case as an organized, prolonged deprivation of liberty, tied to a clear economic benefit motive, in which each defendant's criminal responsibility was established based on their actual role, degree of control, and benefits obtained. This approach allowed the file to achieve a consistent argumentative structure, clear focus, and sufficient solidity to proceed to the trial phase without creating legal gaps. On that foundation, the trial was opened in accordance with criminal procedure, with the trial panel receiving the entire file prepared from the prosecution phase and determining the scope of the trial to focus on clarifying the chain of organized deprivation of liberty that occurred in Chicago, along with the corresponding legal responsibility of each defendant. The trial sequence began with the reading of the indictments against Robert Miller and Michael Johnson, clearly stating the charges, legal grounds, and applicable penalty ranges, thereby setting the legal boundaries for the entire litigation process. The trial panel required the parties to focus on proving or rebutting the elements constituting the offenses, avoiding digressions into arguments outside the scope of the file. The prosecution opened by presenting the case developments in chronological order, from approach control, confinement, to the escape process, emphasizing the continuity and systematic nature of the acts, while pointing out the connections among physical evidence, witness statements, and expert conclusions. Evidence was introduced in sections, accompanied by explanations of its origin, collection method, and probative value, to help the trial panel fully grasp the overall picture before proceeding to in-depth arguments. The defense countered by questioning the reliability of the victim's statement after a long period of confinement and psychological trauma, while also challenging the degree of inference in linking indirect evidence to each defendant's role. The debate over evidence thus became the core of the trial, with both sides focusing on determining whether each piece of data was sufficiently solid to prove criminal intent and the degree of control. The trial panel repeatedly required clarification of the causal relationship between the accused acts and their actual consequences for the victim, while eliminating arguments based on assumptions without evidentiary support. During the examination phase, forensic experts, scene investigators, financial analysts, and medical evaluators were successively called to explain their expert conclusions in detail, from the conditions of the confinement environment, traces of prolonged habitation, to the consistency between the medical file and field elements. These explanations helped the trial panel evaluate not only the existence of evidence, but also the scientific limitations and reliability level of each analytical method. When moving to assessing each defendant's responsibility, the trial separated the operational role from the organizational role, treating this as a key principle to avoid conflating responsibilities. For Robert Miller, the trial panel examined each specific act the defendant directly carried out, from the deliberate approach unlawful control, organizing the victim's removal from his familiar living environment, to maintaining confinement and adjusting control conditions over a long period. Defense arguments claiming Robert was merely following orders were placed against evidence showing the defendant had significant decision-making authority in daily operations, allowing the trial panel to assess the level of proactivity and awareness of consequences. For Michael Johnson, the focus of examination was not on physical presence at the confinement location, but on his capacity to organize, direct and benefit from the plan, with arguments centering on whether the chain of indirect evidence was sufficient to prove overall control. The trial panel analyzed the business competition context, benefit-driven motive, employer-employee relationship, and role division structure to evaluate the reasonableness and consistency of the prosecution's arguments. The examination of mastermind and executor elements was conducted systematically, with each defendant placed in their actual position within the chain of acts, based on the scope of decision-making authority, ability to foresee consequences, and degree of control over the course of events. The trial panel emphasized that not directly carrying out the confinement acts did not exclude criminal responsibility if a directing role was proven, while affirming that the direct executor still bore full responsibility, even if not the plan's initiator. Throughout the trial, both parties were guaranteed the right to present and rebut, but all arguments had to be tightly tied to evidence already admitted into the file, ensuring fairness, transparency, and adherence to adversarial principles. When the examination and debate phases concluded, the trial panel conducted a final review of all clarified content, from the sequence of events, evidence value, to each defendant's level of responsibility, to ensure every necessary element for assessing criminal liability had been fully raised within the procedural framework. The entire process reflected a trial centered on legal structure and evidentiary proof, where every decision by the trial panel was grounded in what had been legally and objectively proven during the proceedings, completing the trial phase adjudication without exceeding the scope of issues raised in the case file. After the trial panel completed its deliberation based on the entire file, evidence, and public arguments presented, the trial moved into the sentencing phase with the presiding judge reading the official verdict, establishing the final legal consequences for each defendant in the case that occurred in Chicago. The sentence was pronounced according to the principle of individualizing criminal responsibility, where each sentence directly reflected the role, scope of control, motive, and degree of danger created by each defendant's conduct throughout the prolonged criminal process. For Michael Johnson, the trial panel sentenced him to 35 years in federal prison, determining that the defendant was the mastermind who played the central role in designing, coordinating, and maintaining the entire plan to deprive Samuel Ellington of his liberty in order to eliminate a business competitor in the commercial environment. In pronouncing the sentence, the judge analyzed that although Michael did not directly approach or confine the victim, it was his selection of the target, recruitment of the executor, determination of the long-term control method, and direct benefiting from the victim's removal from business management life that placed Michael in the position of bearing the highest responsibility within the criminal structure. The trial panel emphasized that the 35-year sentence was based not only on the actual consequences that occurred, but also on the potential danger level of the plan, including the risk of depriving the victim of his life if the plan had not been disrupted. In the legal grounds analysis section, the judge cited relevant federal provisions concerning conspiracy to kidnap, organized unlawful detention, and aggravating circumstances such as profit motive, prolonged duration of the offense, thorough preparation, and the capacity to cause serious harm to personal liberty. The trial panel also considered that Michael Johnson had ample opportunities to terminate the plan at various points, but chose not to do so, thereby demonstrating persistent and continuous criminal intent. For Robert Miller, the trial panel sentenced him to 25 years in prison, reflecting his direct operational role in approaching, controlling, organizing the victim's movement, and maintaining the confinement of Samuel Ellington under strict control conditions. In pronouncing the sentence, the judge clarified that Robert was not the plan's initiator, but participated with full awareness of the illegality of his actions and their possible consequences, while holding an irreplaceable role in turning Michael's plan into reality. The 25-year sentence was determined based on the federal penalty framework for offenses related to kidnapping and unlawful detention, taking into account limited mitigating factors, such as Robert not being the ultimate mastermind, while applying significant aggravating circumstances, including the prolonged duration of confinement, the degree of physical and psychological control over the victim, and participation in the preparatory phase for the planned execution. In the analysis of the legal grounds for the disparity between the two sentences, the trial panel emphasized the difference in scope of decision-making authority and degree of benefit, with Michael Johnson identified as having the highest level of control over the entire course of events, and as the strategic beneficiary of the case's outcome. The judge explained that federal law does not permit hiding behind an indirect role to evade criminal responsibility, and in cases with clear role division structures, the organizer and director must receive punishment commensurate with the danger level of that role. The trial panel also analyzed that imposing heavy sentences on both defendants served to reflect the judicial system's view on the seriousness of prolonged deprivation of liberty acts, especially when concealed under legitimate covers such as business cooperation. The pronounced sentence was intended not only to punish the individual defendants, but also to carry general deterrent meaning, sending a clear message that sophisticated criminal plans based on long-term calculation and role assignment would not be taken lightly, merely for lacking overt violence. During the sentencing process, the judge affirmed that every decision was based on what had been legally proven at trial, with full opportunity for argument by both sides, and was not influenced by emotional factors or external pressure. The conclusion of the trial process was established by the declaration that procedural requirements had been fully met, the defendant's rights had been guaranteed, and the verdict reflected a balance between aggravating and mitigating circumstances that had been comprehensively considered. The pronounced verdict officially concluded the trial process and definitively established the legal consequences for Michael Johnson and Robert Miller, based on their roles, level of participation, and the dangerous nature of the proven organized chain of deprivation of liberty acts before the court. With the aspect of criminal responsibility closed within the legal framework, the focus of the case no longer lay in the sentence or procedural steps, but shifted to the long-term consequences beyond the scope of adjudication. For Samuel Ellington, those consequences did not appear suddenly or as isolated events, but gradually emerged as a long-term reality, deeply permeating his physical, psychological, and social life in Chicago, where the legal conclusion did not mean that all the impacts of the case had ended. On the physical level, doctors recorded that the prolonged period of confinement, under strict control conditions, left irreversible damage, including chronic malnutrition, reduced bone density, loss of muscle mass, and metabolic disorders related to prolonged lack of natural light and restricted movement. Even though Samuel received intensive treatment after his return, his body no longer responded as it once did, with persistent dull pain, constant fatigue, and clearly defined limitations in his ability to sustain continuous work. These effects were not acute, but became part of everyday life, forcing him to adjust his daily rhythm, accept new limits, and rely on long-term medical monitoring. Alongside the physical damage were profound, complex and prolonged psychological effects, manifested through symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including sleep disturbances, intrusive flashbacks, a state of heightened vigilance, and anxiety responses disproportionate to the circumstances. Samuel struggled to maintain a sense of safety even in familiar spaces, and minor triggers such as metallic sounds, dim light, or enclosed areas could provoke strong physiological reactions. These manifestations did not disappear after the trial. In fact, they became even more pronounced once the legal pressure ended, leaving a void where he had to confront memories that had previously been overshadowed by the investigation and trial procedures. Psychological experts assessed that Samuel's mental recovery did not follow a linear path, with periods of improvement alternating with relapses, requiring long-term intervention rather than short-term therapies. These consequences directly affected Samuel's business career, as the prolonged interruption in his managerial role completely altered the structure and standing of the company he had once built. During the time he was missing and throughout his subsequent recovery process, strategic partners withdrew, contracts were terminated or transferred, and market share was seized by other competitors, creating a gap that was nearly impossible to close. When Samuel attempted to return to the business environment, he faced not only objective market changes, but also subjective limitations in physical stamina, concentration ability, and stress tolerance. Decision-making became more difficult, processing speed slowed, and the confidence that had once been the foundation of his leadership role was eroded by the prolonged experience of being controlled. As a result, Samuel had to accept the reality that his previous career could not be restored to its original state, and every effort to rebuild took place within the framework of these new limitations. The impact on Samuel's family was no less profound, as the months of waiting in uncertainty left lasting psychological marks on every member. His return did not erase the memories of his prolonged absence, but placed the family in a new phase of adjustment, where the joy of reunion coexisted with constant worry about Samuel's health and mental state. Family relationships had to learn to adapt to changes in his behavior, emotions, and communication ability, from Samuel becoming more reserved in sharing to his tendency to withdraw from shared activities. Family roles also shifted, as members who had carried responsibilities during his absence now had to redistribute them, creating a restructuring process that was far from simple. Samuel's difficulties in social reintegration were clearly evident in his struggles with ordinary social interactions, particularly in crowded environments or situations requiring quick trust. The feeling of being disconnected from the common rhythm of life, combined with the fear of being misunderstood or judged, caused him to narrow his range of communication and limit participation in community activities. Social relationships that existed before his disappearance were not easily re-established, because the time gap and the changes within Samuel himself created a distance that was difficult to express in words. The reality after the case closed showed that legal justice, though necessary and decisive in meaning, did not equate to fully restoring what had been lost. The sentences imposed on those responsible could not reverse the physical damage, erase traumatic memories, or immediately rebuild the broken relationships. Samuel had to learn to live with these consequences as part of his present life, accepting that recovery is a prolonged, complex process with no clear endpoint. Medical, psychological, and social support became foundational elements in his life, not as temporary measures, but as necessary conditions to maintain stability. From the perspective of consequences, the case demonstrated that the impact of deprivation of liberty does not remain confined to the period of confinement, but extends for many years afterward, profoundly affecting personal identity, social roles, and the ability to fully participate in economic and social life. For Samuel Ellington, his return did not mark the end of the tragedy, but opened a different phase of existence, where daily life is shaped by continuous adaptation to new limitations and irreversible changes left by the period of control. With the case legally closed and all criminal responsibility established within the judicial system in Chicago, Samuel's condition gradually stabilized in a functional sense, reflecting a new point of balance after the incident rather than a complete recovery or a return to his former life. Legally speaking, the case concluded in the full administrative sense. The sentence took effect, no appeals were pending review, and the relevant authorities had no further obligation to investigate or prosecute additionally. This clarity created a definitive boundary between the legal past and present life, but for Samuel, that boundary did not mean his life returned to its old track. Currently, he maintains the ability to care for himself and participate in daily activities at a limited level, with a schedule designed around long-term medical and psychological needs. Recent specialist evaluations show that Samuel's health condition has not continued to deteriorate, yet it has not reached a level of recovery sufficient to eliminate all consequences of the confinement period, forcing him to accept that certain limitations in physical strength, endurance, and stress tolerance will remain long-term and stable. Mentally, Samuel maintains relatively good control over trauma responses, but he no longer seeks a state of normal as before. Instead, he adopts a cautious precautionary way of living that minimizes situations capable of triggering feelings of loss of control. Memories of the time he was deprived of liberty do not emerge intensely or constantly, but exist as a quiet underlying layer, influencing how he assesses risk, builds trust, and makes decisions. In social life, Samuel chooses to maintain relationships within a narrow scope, prioritizing stability, predictability, and high reliability over expanding his network as he did before disappearing. This narrowing does not stem from isolation or social withdrawal, but from a clear awareness of his mental energy limits and capacity to handle prolonged complex interactions. The relationships he keeps are more enduring than lively, reflecting a shift in how Samuel defines the value of social connection after the incident. In his career, Samuel does not return to the central managerial role once tied to a high-intensity, constant-pressure lifestyle, nor does he pursue full restoration of his lost position in the competitive business environment. Instead, he accepts a limited participation model, where his experience and knowledge are used at an advisory or strategic guidance level within controlled boundaries, allowing him to maintain a sense of usefulness without facing demands beyond his current capabilities. This change is not viewed by Samuel as a step backward, but as a necessary adjustment to protect long-term stability, both physically and mentally. For his family, Samuel's current state is seen as a physical return, but in a different form from before, forcing family relationships to restructure around new expectations. The family no longer lives in indefinite waiting or fear of loss as during his disappearance, but neither do they aim for complete normalization. Instead, they accept that the changes that occurred will continue to exist and must be respected. Family interactions are adjusted to avoid unnecessary pressure, prioritizing emotional stability and predictability, reflecting a new form of balance formed after the crisis. The aftermath of the case no longer appears in the form of legal procedures, news coverage, or public attention, but exists in everyday details, from the way Samuel chooses living spaces, arranges his time, to his habit of always maintaining backup plans and daily routines. These after effects do not create new tragedy, but they also do not fully disappear, becoming part of the life context that Samuel has learned to live with, rather than trying to eliminate. The legal file has officially closed, bringing clarity on responsibility and consequences within the legal framework, but it cannot fully restore his old life, or completely erase the impact of prolonged deprivation of liberty. Samuel's current state therefore cannot be described by the concept of full recovery or closure, but more accurately, as a resilient state of adaptation, where he exists on the boundary between what was lost and what can still be maintained, with clear awareness of his own limits and acceptance that some voids will never be filled. Closing the story at this point does not carry the meaning of full relief or comfort, but reflects an open reality, where Samuel Ellington continues to live in a life that is legally stable, yet still carries the long-lasting traces of the incident, leaving the story in a quiet state, neither dramatized further, nor promising complete redemption, but honest about the way the long-term consequences of a deprivation of liberty case typically persist after all sentences have been handed down and all procedures have reached their end. The story of Samuel Ellington delivers a very real warning for life in the United States today, where the line between safety and risk is sometimes obscured by the very structures that seem the most legitimate and familiar. Samuel did not disappear in a dark alley or after overt violent behavior, but from an ordinary work schedule in a competitive business environment where trust is built through contracts, appointments, and professional language. The detail of Robert Miller approaching Samuel under the guise of business cooperation highlights an important lesson in modern society. Danger does not only come from strangers who appear threatening, but also from relationships that seem standard and legitimate. Life in the United States today values speed, efficiency, and networking, but this story reminds us that personal caution, especially in relationships involving benefit, is never unnecessary. Another lesson lies in how the legal system ultimately established clear responsibility for both the executor and the mastermind like Michael Johnson. That reflects a core value of American society. Justice does not only look at the hand that carries out the act, but traces back to the mind directing it from behind. However, the story also reveals a hard-to-accept reality. Legal justice does not equate to fully restoring life. Samuel returned, but with depleted health, a ruined career, a family that had to restructure, and a mental life carrying prolonged after-effects. From this, the lesson for every individual is not to underestimate the long-term impact of risks that seem non-violent, to build strong personal, legal, and psychological support networks, and more importantly, to understand that protecting oneself in modern society is not only about avoiding violence, but about early recognition of power and benefit structures that can turn people into tools. If you value stories that reflect the dark but very real side of modern life and the costly lessons behind justice, please subscribe to the channel to join us on the upcoming journeys. Thank you for following Samuel Ellington's story to the end, and see you in the next video, where each case is not only recounted, but also confronted head-on with its long-lasting consequences.